Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Skidmore. I'm the director of the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development. Um, Welcome to today's webinar. This webinar is actually a part of a Combating Opioids webinar series that is supported by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And we're partnering with Purdue University on this. So we're glad to be able to provide this webinar today. Before we start with the webinar today, I just wanted to highlight that we do have ongoing scheduled webinars you can take note of here. We do have an additional opioid-related webinar coming up later this spring, and we'll send out updates as that date comes. So we'll let you know about that. So today we have Captain Toby Frost from the Lafayette Fire Department. I'll introduce him in just a moment, but I want to talk about the webinar first. The title is Fentanyl, Just the Tip of the Iceberg. Fentanyl and synthetic opioids have changed the way firefighters and hazmat technicians are responding to the crisis. And so we have growing pressures on emergency services. It's placing pressure on local government budgets and emergency response system across the country. And as we will hear, the challenges are going to continue for years into the future. Captain Tobias Frost is a member of the Lafayette Fire Department in Indiana. He's a team leader for the hazmat team and is founder of the illicit lab response team. He's a department instructor for firefighters, recruits, local industry, teaching fire sciences and technical issues around hazardous materials. He is a continuing lecturer at Purdue University and has taught courses and provided instruction really all across the country. So with that, I'd like to pass it on to Captain Tobias Frost. And for the participants, just want to remind you that you can type in a question or a comment at any time. Captain Frost may address that as he gives his presentation, or perhaps he'll wait until the end, but please feel free to add a comment or ask a question along the way. So with that, Captain Frost, thanks for being here, and it's all yours.
Thank you very much. So to date in the United States, we've seen roughly 53 different fentanyl analogs through DEA lab seizures, state lab seizures, and things of that nature. And one of the problems is that that's really just the tip of the iceberg, and that's kind of the point behind my presentation. Theoretically, there's about 1,900 different analogs that are possible, and only about 1,400 of those are of some interest illicitly or for illicit use. But 512 are actually strong enough and weak enough they meet that magic sweet point of possible illicit drug use. So we've seen 53 to date. There's 500 more to come at least, and it's just, like I said, just beginning of the iceberg here. There's been all kinds of media hype about fentanyl, a lot of hysteria out there, a lot of bad information. We keep seeing all these different headlines that one touch can kill you. You're going to overdose. It's going to reach out and grab you. And this is one, the gray death is one that just started circulating in the media just in the last day and a half, 2 days. And a lot of this stuff there's a lot of bad information out there. So I'm going to touch briefly on how it's really going to hurt you, and then talk about how it's impacting us and why this impact is really just getting started. The drugs can look virtually like anything. It's not like, marijuana, which everybody knows is a green leafy substance. It has kind of a uniform appearance. The user can use it through needles. They can make it look like candy for party drugs, crystal. Up in the top of my screen, you'll see the pictures of Pez candy. This was an actual online dark web advertisement for Pez candy that was laced with synthetic opioid. You had the bust in Georgia that looked like kids' vitamins, Vicodin tablets that looked pretty real. So to know what to look for, it can literally look like anything you want. The dealer, you've got all these party drugs down here. These are all actual seized pills, what they look like. So it can look like just about anything. And for us, that becomes a big challenge in trying to identify it, because it's not we can't just look at it and say, oh, I think this is crystal meth, or I think this is fentanyl, or this is uh, W18, or some of the other synthetic ones that are out there. So that creates all kinds of problems for us. And why this is such a problem is if you look at the number of prescriptions that are prescribed throughout the United States, we have many states that are prescribing more prescriptions than there are residents in the state. And so this is the top 5 currently as you look across, and based on prescriptions per 100 people. And you can see a lot of these are more than 100 people, but even the 5 lowest states down here are prescribing prescriptions nearly one for every other person. And so if you think about that, if you look around your office, the person that's sitting next to you, in theory, statistically, could have a prescription for an opioid. And we're just talking about legitimate opioid prescriptions. The average age for somebody to try an opioid in the United States for the first time is age 12. And those are prescribed legitimately, typically for a sports injury or maybe wisdom teeth coming out or something like that. And so people are getting exposed to this at a very young age. And then when they're more susceptible to addiction, maybe their brain isn't quite mature enough to deal with it. But a lot of the people have come about this through very legitimate means. We can think of lots of stories about people in the media who have, Rush Limbaugh, Tom Petty, Prince, people who had at one point a legitimate prescription for pain management, and at some point can no longer get that prescription refilled and turn to illicit means and to manage their addiction. The map you're looking at right now, what I really want to point out is all the dark brown spots, because those are all the counties in the United States that prescribe more than the number of prescriptions per residence for that county. And so you kind of get a breadth of this problem. It crosses all social economic groups, because this isn't just your stereotypic drug user. A lot of these people started out as legitimate users with a prescription to manage pain of some sort, and it just spiraled out of control. If you look at the number of seizures in the United States that the DEA is reporting, we've had fentanyl around for a long time. The first fentanyl lab in the United States was about 1988 in Pittsburgh, but we've always had around 300, 400, 500 seizures annually. There's a little blip right around 2006, and that was traced to a single illicit lab down in Mexico. And then we stabilized again. But in 2013, what happened was the sudden uptick was it started being sold on the open web or the dark web. And so suddenly, instead of having to go through a drug cartel or drug dealers or street dealer, individuals could actually go on the dark web, order the material from overseas, and have it shipped. And since that availability has come, we've had this exponential growth in the number of reports of fentanyl seen through the DEA lab. And that's kind of hand in hand with what we see with the overdoses that everybody is seeing, that once it became readily available at 2013, 2014, the overdoses just started to spike off the chart. And for us in the emergency services, all through the early 2000s, we had a few overdoses we would deal with, not horrible, no exponential growth, but since 2013, overdoses have become a regular part of our day. My station will run 2-3 overdoses a day, and we're in a modest-sized town. So it's really become a burden on us, not just from an expense standpoint for Narcan and things like that, but just from wear and tear on responders, vehicles, using different sources, or excuse me, just the sheer number of runs we have to work with, and responder fatigue has been a big problem. One of the questions I got real quick was, how did the dark web method of getting it come about? I'll jump back to that real quick. Basically what happened was, in the early to late mid 2000s, the DEA told the chemical manufacturers in China that their generic prescriptions no longer met the standard to be imported in the United States. And so you had roughly 30,000 chemical companies in China that overnight lost their source of income. And so they transformed into, it's kind of a little tongue-in-cheek, but they call it research chemicals. And so now they're selling those research chemicals on the web. It is a billion-dollar industry in China, and it's not going away. I'll talk more about the economic incentive here in a minute, but it's just essentially a little bit of chemistry, you can make it anywhere. And then if we look at this trend in overdose and drug poisonings, the startling thing is that as of 2009, that became the #1 source of death, outpacing homicides, firearms, motor vehicle crashes, and that rate of growth is just continuing on. So you can see by 2017, newer numbers aren't available yet, but it's just absolutely outpacing everything else out there. And with the availability of the drugs and this dependency that's been developed, that trend's not likely to change. So at what cost? Well, from a direct healthcare perspective, the estimates from 2015 to 2018 from the CDC say that it's cost during that 4-year period $631 billion in direct healthcare expenses. That's a pretty startling number. However, if you look at the total impact on social impact, loss of production, and kind of take all that into perspective, during that same time period, the total social economic impact is actually estimated to be $2.5 trillion, which is roughly 3% of our gross national product. That is a staggering number when you look at that, and that kind of takes in the impact across the board. For me, for our fire department, the impact has come in increased run load. We're now carrying Narcan, which we never carried before, and there's some expenses to that. We've actually seen our medical supply expenses go up by roughly 300%. So it depends locally where you are in the country what that impact is, but the reality is it's taking a lot of our time and a lot of our resources. Traditionally, when we look at illicit substances, there's a massive machine involved. You have to grow the product. So if we're talking in terms of heroin, I've got to start with the poppies. And then I have to harvest the poppies, get the part I want off the poppy to make the drug, process it, then I've got to package it, and then I've got to smuggle it in the United States somehow. So go fast boats, submarines, carriers, however that is, before I can get it to the street in the wholesale level. And that is a massive machine. Well, one of the big changes now is that all someone has to do is order it online. They don't have to go through this massive market. I don't have to have this big agricultural machine stood up and all those resources tied in. They can go online and buy it. Or as the Border Patrol gets better and better at tightening our borders, people are going to start making it. And I don't have to grow it. I just need certain chemicals and a spot to do it. And I could do it anywhere in the United States. I could do it in a garage, a laboratory, virtually anywhere. I just need those core chemicals. And so that's another reason why I say we're just the tip of this iceberg. I've eliminated this massive machine, and now all someone has to do is get it online. So what's the incentive? It's purely profit. At the end of the day, it's profit. There is no whole food for heroin. You can't go get pure organic heroin. And I will even go so far as to say there is none available in the United States. In the state of Indiana, I can tell you that the state police lab sees that 98.7% of all of their drugs are cut with a synthetic of something. There just isn't any pure organic drugs out there anymore. If you were to buy a wholesale kilo of heroin in the Middle East and you smuggle it into the United States, that wholesale cost is right around $6,000 to $7,000 for a kilogram, approximately. Wholesale, I'm going to get about a kilogram out of that. And so the wholesale value, once you get it into the United States, ready for wholesale distribution, it's about $80,000. So the revenue from 1 kilogram of organic heroin in the United States is roughly $80,000. That's not a bad profit margin. But when you look at the synthetics now, that all changes. So now that same kilogram, if I buy, or someone were to buy a kilogram of pure fentanyl off the dark web, you're going to pay roughly around $4,000 to $5,000 for a kilogram of pure fentanyl. Once it's imported in the United States, it just comes normal parcel, smuggled in the United States. They hide the labeling, things like that. And that same kilogram now can be cut 16 to 24 times. The wholesale value is about a 4 to 6% concentration of active ingredient. It's still worth $80,000 a kilogram because from a user's perspective, you can't tell the difference between synthetic or organic. But the big difference is that same profit, instead of being $80,000 a kilogram, is now approaching $2 million a kilogram. And so that's why I say this is not going away. The profit incentive is so huge that it's going to keep coming in. So fentanyl, we know a lot about. I talked about all the hysteria about one touch is going to kill you. If you look at it, you're going to die. You're going to overdose, all that hysteria. But the reality is, scientifically, we know a lot about fentanyl. It's been around since the 50s. It started being used in medical practice as early as 63. By 68, it was widely used in medical practice. And quite frankly, from a pharmaceutical perspective, it's a great product. It's very effective. There's very few side effects. It has a very short half-life. And when it's used appropriately, it's a great pharmaceutical product. But the beauty of this is there's been an enormous amount of research about fentanyl. So it's really not this big mystery. It's just that a lot of people have never really dealt with it. And so we keep hearing the hysteria about overdose by touching. And can you absorb it through your skin? Absolutely. But I'm going to show you from science right here why that's not a realistic problem. And for me as a responder, or me assisting other responding agencies, that's where that becomes a problem, because there's this absolute hysteria. We constantly are going on calls across the country for officers who are down, officers who touch something, jailers who touch something and are feeling symptoms. So the reality is that I know the lethal dose for fentanyl in the blood is about 2.55 milligrams. That's a well-documented research scientific fact. I also know that I know the exact rate it absorbs through the body, and based on an average human person, about 18,000 square centimeters of skin is an average person. The rate of absorption through your skin is 61 nanograms per centimeter squared per hour. I know it's a lot of numbers, but basically what I'm saying is we could calculate with sound science and research the rate that it'll absorb through your skin. So in order to get a lethal dose of fentanyl, if you covered your skin 100%, imagine burying your body in sand, but instead of sand, it is pure fentanyl, not street cut, pure, absolute, from the source, pure fentanyl. Cover every square centimeter of skin, protect your respiratory, because right now I'm only talking about through your skin. It would take 2.3 hours to reach that lethal dose. I mean, that's not even a realistic, you would have to try really, really hard to do that. And it's going to cost a fortune to get that much fentanyl. So it's not a realistic operational concern. 2.3 hours, nobody's going to sit still that long and not get it off of them. So what's a more realistic exposure? A EMS responder or firefighter gets fentanyl in the palm of their hand from working with the patient. And for the sake of discussion, let's just say it's pure fentanyl. Most street cut product is going to have 1 to 3% active ingredient, and the rest of it's just cutting agent. So we're going to err on the side of the worst side of the fence, and we're going to say it's 100% pure fentanyl, which if you took, would kill you. But through your skin, cover the palm of your hand. That's roughly 5 square centimeters. If you left it on there for 15 minutes before washing it off, your actual exposure is only going to be 76 nanograms. And that is a tiny, tiny amount. And by the way, it takes 2 hours to absorb through your skin. So your level of 76 nanograms is going to happen 2 hours after your exposure, not right after you touched it. And so what does that mean? Well, our lethal dose is 2.5 billion nanograms. An anesthetic dose to start taking your pain away is 25,000 nanograms. And an analgesic dose to help your headache a little bit is 2,500 nanograms. And so we're a factor of whole order of magnitude off. We've only got an exposure of 76 nanograms after 15 minutes. It's not even going to take care of your back pain. And so all that science, all I'm trying to prove to you through science is that if you touch it, you will not overdose. It's not going to happen. It's not physically possible. We have all the science, we have all the research. We know you can't do it that way. Hand in hand with that, this is some personal protective equipment recommendations that were made for first responders. And whenever you're dealing with an overdose, we're really in this light blue area, this light, low risk. And if you'll notice, the recommended personal protective equipment is simply gloves, regular old medical gloves. We're actually more concerned about bloodborne pathogens than we are the drug itself. There's just no real risk there. The risk from fentanyl comes from inhaling it, getting it in your eyes, nose, or mouth. Those are the fast routes of exposure. There are a couple incidents that have happened in the United States where responders inhaled pure product and overdosed very quickly, and that's our biggest concern. But whenever you're dealing with someone who's overdosed or using or has some pills, whether you're in a student that's carrying drugs or an inmate that's smuggled drugs in, or just an overdose on the street, there's really very low risk for the responder or the EMS person that's dealing with that person. And so all we want to do is keep it off of you. The beauty of fentanyl is we've got an antidote for it. I can give you naloxone, or commonly known as Narcan, to counteract the drug. But there's a tendency people lose sight of the symptoms of an opioid overdose. And so what I hear a lot of times are, my heart's beating out of my chest, I'm dizzy, I just feel like I'm breathing real fast, I can't catch my breath. None of those are symptoms of an opioid overdose. An opioid overdose is depressed respirations, tunnel vision, starting to feel like your body's shutting down, you're very lethargic, you're not all pumped up. But a lot of those symptoms are anxiety-based or maybe some other product besides an opioid. So whenever you're dealing with Narcan, the easiest symptom to manage is less than 8 respirations a minute. If they're breathing on their own, they don't need Narcan. You don't have to give it to them. If you don't have Narcan, you stumble across a student or somebody in the public who appears to be overdosing, all you have to do is rescue breathe for them and they'll be okay. When the EMS gets there, they can apply the naloxone, but at the end of the day, all you really have to do is breathe for them. From a responder perspective, if I have somebody who accidentally gets exposed, I have the antidote with me, and all I have to do is breathe for them if I don't have enough antidote. Another common urban myth out there is that there are Narcan-resistant opioids, and there is no such thing. Pharmaceutically, that's not the way it works. They both bind to the same receptor, and Narcan simply knocks the opioid off that receptor and binds. The problem is that a lot of people are getting Narcan that didn't take an opioid to start with, and so if I don't have opioid on my system, Narcan's not going to work. It only works for the opioids, so the fentanyls and related substances. The other problem is that if I simply take too much fentanyl, the Narcan can't overcome it. Anybody who's familiar with diabetics, this is an analogy I use with medics all the time. We're used that if I have somebody who has low blood sugar, I can give them some glucose or some D50 to bring their blood sugar up very quickly. But if they don't eat, their blood sugar is going to crash out again, and they're going to go right back in the same problem. Narcan works very similarly. It has a shorter half-life than fentanyl, so it's got about a 1-hour half-life. So I give somebody Narcan, I bring them back. Depending how much fentanyl they had in their system, the Narcan will actually wear off before all the fentanyl is processed out of their blood. So once the Narcan wears off, they're going to relapse. That's why it's so critical. If someone overdoses, they really need to go to the hospital, because if they don't, odds are that they're going to crash again in about an hour. And we see that a lot. We go a lot of patients will go back to an hour and a half, 2 hours later, they've overdosed again. And it's not that they necessarily went out and took the drugs again. It's still on board their system, and the Narcan simply wore off. So that's something we have to watch out for. But to date, there is no such thing as a Narcan-resistant opioid. It's just pharmaceutically, it doesn't work like that. There is no such thing. So one of the other huge problems for first responders that we've run into is traditionally, if I had somebody overdose on meth or spice or something like that, when I show up in their living room, I just simply load them in the ambulance and away we go, and we leave at the end of the day. The problem with synthetic opioids and some of these other synthetic drugs that are out there is there can be a very toxic residue left behind. And so now I have to ask the question, is the scene safe after I leave? Now I have to deal with this product in some fashion, which means doing some sort of decontamination to make the home safe. We didn't originally do this, but we've had a couple cases. There was a case in a home where a son overdosed and died, and EMS was there. They treated him very quickly, loaded him, took him to the hospital. He actually died at the hospital. Mother was very upset. She started cleaning up the bathroom after everybody had left and had an accidental exposure, overdosed, and was actually found the next day dead by her daughter. And it was totally an accidental second exposure. She was not a user, but in the process of cleaning that scene up, she became exposed. So this is just a stock picture of a hotel room. It's not any particular chain, but there was a case in Massachusetts where a 2-year-old overdosed. They were playing on the carpet. She was playing on the carpet in the hotel room. She overdosed. Mom called 911. Police and EMS got there, and they were a little skeptic that mom had nothing to do with it. And in the process of processing the scene, they saved the little girl. They Narcaned her. They brought her back. It was clearly an opioid overdose. And one of the firefighters said, "Hey, weren't we here 2 days ago for an overdose?" Long story short, they did some testing, and there was contamination in the room from the previous overdose, and the child playing in the carpet was playing in the drugs, and that's how they overdosed. So for us, this is a whole new problem we've never really had to deal with. Traditionally, we just load people up and we leave the scene. Back in the days of meth houses, the health department put a sticker on the door. Nobody was supposed to enter. But there wasn't this low toxicity threshold that we had to deal with. And now we have to ask ourselves the question, can we leave this scene safely? Do I need to do some sort of decontamination? We have some products that we use. We have an electrostatic sprayer we use, much like what a hospital would use to get rid of bugs, but we're using it to neutralize these synthetics. But that adds a cost burden to us also. So now we have more equipment we have to purchase, neutralizing agent. We got to be able to identify the product so we know which is the correct agent to use to neutralize it. So this is a whole new monster for us, and quite frankly, relatively expensive for us to deal with. It's not something we have a budget item to deal with, and off-the-shelf products are not going to resolve this issue for us. So for us in the emergency response world, one of the key things we have to do right on the front end is be able to identify these products. And that's not as simple as it might think. There is no blister pouch like you see on TV on cops when they put the meth in a little pouch and they crack it, and if it turns pink, you got meth. You can't do that for the synthetics because there's so many out there. 53 different fentanyl analogs seen to date in the United States, over 700 synthetic cannabinoids, over 300 different synthetic cathinones, and so you can't possibly carry a different pouch for each one of those, and it's a chemical reaction that changes the color. So wet chemistry simply doesn't work. That's not a good solution. So for us, the challenge becomes, how do we identify these unknowns to identify treatment, to identify decontamination needs, and to identify emerging threats on the street? Because traditionally, to send something to the lab to be identified to the state lab, you're looking at an 8-month turnaround. Well, 8 months from now, there's going to be a different drug on the street. So trying to get frontline information out about what are people using, how are they using it, with some sort of positive identification is a challenge. And basically, there's a couple inexpensive things out there. BTNX strips are like an immunoassay, kind of like a home pregnancy test. They're about $1 a test, but they're only good for fentanyl. So if they're not taking fentanyl, it's of no value to me. I won't be able to identify it. Detectachem is a wet chemistry test, but again, it only identifies about 5 different chemicals, and I kind of have an idea what I'm looking for. So that means I need some high-end science. And each of these items, GCMS, Raman, FTIR, which are high-end technologies for identifying products, all come with a very big price tag of around $100,000 plus or minus per instrument. And so the challenge becomes, we don't have the budget to support that. And trying to find funding so that we can identify these products has been a huge hurdle that we're still trying to overcome. And this is relatively new for us. This has never really been a problem for us. So there's some emerging technology, and hopefully this technology to come down as time goes on. But right now, it's a very expensive price tag for us to deal with. And this is one of our huge challenges. And then what I'd like to kind of close up with is, I said this is just the tip of the iceberg. We're talking about fentanyl. We're talking about opioids. That's what we see. That's what's above the surface. But there are literally thousands and thousands of chemicals from other drug families on the synthetic market that are out there that are just below the surface. They maybe aren't common yet, they maybe aren't popular yet, but they're just as dangerous, just as toxic for people. And without that emerging technology, we're not going to be able to identify this stuff because it's so new. These chemical companies or these illicit manufacturers, all they got to do is change the chemical a little bit, and some of the current technology can't identify it. So you got to go to that high-end stuff. And so this is the new normal. I don't have to grow it. I don't have to harvest it. All I need is some chemicals to manufacture it, and I could literally do it everywhere. And that's the huge challenge for us as responders is I'm not just looking for a grow house or a poppy field or something like that. You could literally do this in a storage unit, and it crosses all social and economic groups. So you're not just looking for, the stereotypic meth house. They've had labs busted in $1 million homes, industrial parks, at pharmaceutical companies, virtually anywhere you can imagine. People are making this stuff. The only saving grace is, unlike methamphetamine, I can't go to a Walmart or Home Depot or a big box store and buy these chemicals. These are actual chemicals I have to buy. So that's a little bit of a challenge, but also easily overcome. And so this is my new norm in responding to illicit labs, is that there is no longer the homegrown approach. It's all chemical, and it can be anywhere. And trying to identify these products is a huge challenge. So with that, I knew I threw a whole bunch of information at you in about 30 minutes there, but does anybody have any questions for me?
Thanks, Captain Frost. So for the participants, if you have some questions or comments, you can just type it in. And to get us started while we're waiting for folks to type in, I was wondering, for the typical emergency responder, what proportion of their time is taken up addressing these kinds of challenges as opposed to other issues?
So it varies dramatically by where you are in the country, but in general, we've gone from 1 to 2% of our time 15 years ago to 30 to 40% of our time today. In Tippecanoe County, we routinely run out of ambulances, and the vast majority of our runs now are overdoses. So it is a huge drain on the resources. And just from a tactical perspective, if the ambulances are all out of service dealing, or even if I have 2 or 3 ambulances out of service dealing with overdoses, other in-home medical issues are not being dealt with. So choking, heart attack, stroke, all those we're not able to address because of having to deal with these overdoses.
And you touched on this a little bit at the end of your talk, but I was wondering, is there a consistent profile of somebody who will have this issue arise? Is it young people? Is it higher or lower income, or is it just all over the board?
It's all over the board. The widest, most common range is age 18 to 55. That's a pretty broad range. And there's no social economic group that's more so than one or the other. You have a lot of people who have started to use this through a legitimate prescription and now have gone to illicit means. The DEA in 2015 really started cracking down on some of these subscription mills out there that were just generating prescriptions for money. And so you have a lot of people that were legitimately managing pain, that were left without a safety net. Essentially, the DEA told doctors, and we're going to pull your license if you keep prescribing to this level, and they essentially just pulled the carpet out from underneath them. So normal people who are trying to do this, that now are looking for other means to manage their addiction.
Right.
One of the questions is, do you think handing out fentanyl strips in the community encourages the use of fentanyl? That's a very touchy subject. Some people feel strongly one way or another. I work with a group. I did some training for a group in Chicago that does street outreach, and they use some of this high-end technology to test what drugs people are using in the street real time. So they're collecting real data and feeding it back to uh, CDC and the Department of Health. And one of the things they've done is they offered these BTNX strips out to people to test. And while I don't think it encourages the use, the reality of what I've seen is if somebody gets a positive test for fentanyl, they'll just use less of the drug at a time. And so it doesn't dissuade them from using the product, they just use less. So we see fewer overdose deaths or fewer overdoses. That's one of the things. If you look at the trend at the end of 2018, there was a downturn in the number of overdose deaths, but I don't think that you can attribute that to less use. I think more so, there's a huge use of Narcan out in the street now. So people that were overdosing and dying even a year or two ago are getting Narcan or revived. So those overdose numbers are going to go down. But I think you'll see, if you look back around 2010, 2011, there was a downtrend in overdoses for a short amount of time, but then it swung right back up. And I think you'll see that happen again. Once people switch to a new illicit substance, their comfort of use and their dose is all going to change. You're going to have a whole bunch more overdoses. Brittany asked about, was there some naloxone literature that could possibly be emailed? I can probably send that to Mark uh, and ask him to forward that on to the attendees.
We're happy to share, or if you have something in a PDF that could be sent electronically, then perhaps people could print off themselves. But if you have some actual literature, we're happy to share that and pass that on.
Yeah, I think I can get my hands on some a PDF flyer on how it works and how to administer it. I don't have that immediately at my fingertips, but I can get that to you later this afternoon or tomorrow.
Brittany, if you can share your email, we can at least be in touch with you and share that information. Okay, I wonder if you could tell me a little bit more about the use of the dark web in order to get access to this kind of material. You said in 2013 that became more feasible. What happened there in terms of being able to buy it in that way?
The big thing was that you had 30,000 plus companies that were no longer allowed to generate revenue the way they had. And so they had to go to a new market. It's been available on the dark web forever, but you just had all these companies suddenly that had to generate revenue some fashion, and this was the fastest way. And originally the way it started was this, we affectionately call it whack-a-mole. In the United States, to schedule a drug illegal, and the same thing's true in Europe, I have to have the exact chemical formula. So if I change one piece of that chemical formula, then it's no longer illegal. So a lot of these companies started out marketing quote unquote legal highs that they would sell, and then when the product was scheduled, they change the chemical formula a little bit and make a new one, and it's no longer illegal. So there's this little cat and mouse game going on. Today they've given up on that. I don't see that nearly as much as I used to. They're just straight up selling products, bringing them into the United States. So the dark web didn't change necessarily, the suppliers changed. And one of the things that's interesting is that it looks like Amazon when you go on there. For those that aren't familiar with the dark web, essentially it's still the internet, but you use a different type of browser. It hides where you are. It's a little more clandestine, so it's more difficult to figure out where people are. And when you kind of have to have an idea of where you're going. You can't quite Google it. You gotta have some idea what's going on, and you use a special browser to go there. These companies now, when I first started doing my research on the dark web, it was very difficult to figure out what they were selling. You had to know something about organic chemistry. You had to recognize chemical names and structures. And quite frankly, a lot of the information was in Chinese, so it was difficult to figure out what they were talking about. Today, it looks just like Amazon. They have pictures, they have descriptions, you can scroll through, they have sales, they have clearance sales, the whole 9 yards. In fact, a lot of them even have a star rating system, just like any other vendor on the internet, and they want to maintain that 5-star rating. One of my friends who's a DEA officer, his job is to buy stuff off the dark web, and he said he constantly gets hounded by these vendors to give him a 5-star rating so people will continue to buy from them, because if somebody has a low rating, nobody will buy from them. And so it's very much like what we would expect to see on the open web. It's just the dark web is a clandestine wide way of doing it and protecting yourself. When you buy small products on the dark web, they ship it over the United States, standard shipping. So UPS, DHL, post office, just normal shipping, and the Border Patrol estimates they're catching roughly 14% of the products coming across the border. And so that means 86% of the products coming across the border are getting through. It's a huge challenge for them. They have the same challenges that we do. So as they get better and better at shutting down the border, they're going to push these people to start producing the product locally or domestically instead of getting it from overseas.
Thanks for that.
I posted my email. I don't know if everybody can see it in the question box or not. If you want to email me, Brittany, shoot me an email, and in the next day or so, I'll send you that pamphlet. Or anyone else that wants it on Narcan, just shoot me an email, and I'll forward it to you.
Well, we have just another minute or two for anybody who'd like to ask an additional question. We also very much appreciate your feedback, so you can see a summary evaluation there. We hope you'll fill that out. I see Chelsea and Brittany are typing, so let's wait for them to finish entering their comment or question.
I'll mention Narcan real quick. Depending where you are in the country, a lot of health departments will give away Narcan, and so that's a good source if you're concerned about having it available because of groups that you interact with or possible exposure. That's a great source to go to. I'll also caution you, a friend of mine who is a nurse got a prescription for Narcan as a precaution and was actually denied health care because she showed a record of having a prescription for Narcan. So I would be careful about going that route, but you might reach out to your local health department and they could probably get you some.
Let's see, we have one more question from Chelsea.
That's a challenge because the big concern is when you start reaching out to everyone, the biggest message I would try to get out there from community outreach is it's essentially Russian roulette, because somebody bought this product that may or may not have been fentanyl from the dark web or imported it in some fashion and then cut the product. A lot of times you end up with essentially street level people trying to cut this product, and that's when I have an active ingredient that's 1 to 3% concentration and I can overdose with as little as a grain of salt. It's extremely difficult for those people to cut the product efficiently without killing people. And so one of the huge things that people need to be aware of is that you're playing Russian roulette. You're relying on that street dealer to do an adequate cut and not overdose or kill you. And so that's a huge challenge. I remember growing up in the 70s, nobody would ever use heroin. That was, there was a lot of outreach and public education about how horrible the drug was, how addictive it was, what the side effects were. And I think we really need to start getting that message out. I don't know what changed when, but it seems to me that social stigma of using these products just isn't there like it was in the late 70s, early 80s. And so I think that essentially we really need to push the message out about the impact and make it so that fentanyl is essentially radioactive, so nobody wants to mess with it. We really got to redevelop that stigma of using this product. I don't know how else to address it. That's really a little bit out of my lane of traffic, but a couple of the key takeaways I like everybody from the webinar to take away is, if you are dealing with somebody who overdosed and you get some on your skin, just use plain soap and water. Just wash it off. You're not going to die. You're not going to overdose. Wash it with plain soap and water. Do not use hand sanitizers. Do not use bleach. Do not use any sort of moisturizing soap, because all of those things can make it absorb through your skin faster, and you could actually make it skin absorbable if you use some of those products. So plain soap and water, wash it off. That's what we train undercover officers to do. Just use plain soap and water to wash it off, and you should be good to go. And you don't want to breathe it, so watch your eyes, nose, and mouth.
Well, okay, I think that's a good place to stop for today. For again, for those of you who really appreciate your feedback on the evaluation, the poll was closed when we initially put it out, but it is open now. So please take a moment and click on that. And so with that, Captain Frost, thanks so much for giving the webinar and sharing this important information. I know I learned a lot about fentanyl, and it really is the tip of the iceberg. So again, we appreciate the challenge and all the work that you do.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Everybody have a good day.
All right. Take care.